Hi there, Danny from the Joshua Tree. Thanks for joining us. Again, we are meeting in person on Sundays, but if you're unable to be with us, then this is a time where we can stop and consider God's word for us. And today I want us to think about a couple of situations that perhaps we often get in. The times when we try and negotiate with God, like when we're in a state of desperation and we say, God, if you can fix this, then I'll go to church forever. I'll pray every day. I'll start giving money, or I'll serve more at church. Or the second option of when we go about life according to our own plans and wisdom until we get stuck. And at that point then we ask God for guidance. But in many situations we are just silent. We don't seek Him. We rather look for our own gut feeling, or we want to hear all the research that's around us, or we value others' opinions more. These two situations of just getting on with life on our own or pleading to God to try and negotiate with Him are two situations that we find ourselves in Joshua chapter 9. As we pick up on this, God has rescued His people from slavery. He's been bringing them towards the promised land, the land that they would inherit. And He has done miraculous works in bringing them from slavery, bringing them through the Red Sea. He's also brought them across the Jordan River, and He has been gifting them the cities that He would live in. He's been doing that at the expense of those who inhabit the land, those who oppose Him. And so we've been seeing that God has been delivering on His promises. We've seen glimpses of the way that His promises are inclusive for those who are willing to respond with a soft heart. And today we're going to see that God delivers refuge. Refuge to people who maybe want to negotiate with Him. Refuge with people who are often silent with Him. It's actually this refuge that provides great hope for humanity. So in chapter 9 verse 1 we read this. Now when all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, the kings in the hill country, in the western foothills, and along the entire coast of the Mediterranean Sea as far as Lebanon, the kings of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites, they came together to wage war against Joshua and Israel. What we see here is that as God's people continue to move forward, they're now counted with an alliance. There's some collaboration. And so, verse 3, however, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. So in verses 1 and 2, we see this picture of the kings collaborating to form a new alliance against God's people. But then in verse 3, we hear this description of another city, Gibeon, taking another approach. They're wanting to resort to this ruse, which is sort of this sense of a plan, something that is going to be negotiating, a form of trickery. There's a sense in this word that it's a little bit malicious in nature. It's a bit of a bargaining tool. And so rather than this collaborated resistance, we see in the people of Gibeon, there is this fearful submission. And so going on, they went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and mouldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." It's a fairly detailed plan. They go all out. They're going to deceive the Israelites. They're going to do that by claiming that they're not really a threat to them. And they're going to ask for a treaty that would provide them refuge from destruction. And so their plan is to say that they're from a faraway place and they've heard the mysterious works and powerful works of God, and they want respite from it. Verse 7, the Israelites said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us, so how can we make a treaty with you?" Now this description of them as Hittites is sort of like the idea that sometimes you talk about people from Melbourne and sometimes you talk about the same people as Victorians. Gibeon were ethnically Hittites, but there's already in the Israelites' interaction some suspicion about the story. If they were from this distant land, Or why would they travel towards their opponents to try and make a treaty? How did they know that the Israelites were going to even continue on? Why wouldn't they just wait and then surrender as the Israelites approach them? And there's a sense here that Joshua doesn't think that it sounds right. Verse 8, "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where do you come from?" Now again, in this position of weak, claiming to be servants, they're trying to sort of break down any opposition. They're not wanting to take on Joshua and the Israelites. There's a submitting posture. And so, having just played their own trick with the ambush to claim Ai, Joshua realizes perhaps that there could be some deception going on. So he probes a bit more. And so they answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth." There's a sense of flattery, isn't there? We've heard about the fame of your God. And rather than speaking about the most recent victories, the most impressive ones so far of Jericho and Ai, they speak about historical events, the rescue from Egypt, the defeat before they crossed the Jordan River. And so it's a cunning strategy, and it helps validate their story. Verse 11, "And our elders and all those living in our country said to us, 'Take provisions for your journey. Go and meet them and say to them, "We are your servants, make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you. But now see how dry and mouldy it is. And these wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are. And our clothes and sandals are worn out by the very long journey." And they have a very clear story about where they've come from. And they've got evidence to try and reinforce the point. And it's quite an inviting story. And so the Israelites consider it further. Verse 14. They sampled the provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live. And the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. What we see here with Joshua and the leaders of the Israelites is that they trust in their own judgment. They've interrogated these people. They've seen and tasted some evidence that backs up their story. But one thing they fail to do is seek the Lord. Now perhaps they thought that God was only concerned about big things. We do that sometimes. We just sort of get caught up in the moment and we think, well, maybe this is just a bit too peripheral. Maybe we think, well, I've got all the evidence before me. I don't need to seek God. But Joshua here does a significant act in making an alliance. And here we see one of his great failures of judgment. He brings the Gibeonites into the fold. He promises them peace. Not only would their lives be spared, but Israel would now have to be their ally. They would have to defend anyone who went to attack the Gibeonites. So verse 16, 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbours living near them. So the Israelites set out and on the third day came to their cities, Gibeon, Kipharah, Beeroth, and Kiriath-Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The ink isn't even dry on the deal when they realise they've been deceived. And so the people of Israel set off to rectify things. Gibeon was only about 10 kilometres from where they were, and having learnt now that Gibeonites had deceived them, they want to rectify it. And their initial reaction is rectification means destruction. But here we start to see that the Gibeonites were part of a larger cohort of cities. And not a syndicate like we saw of the other major cities coming together, but a bit like the city of Sydney. That's made up of the city of Parramatta and Chatswood. And together it's just sort of called Sydney. But Joshua and the other leaders take control of the masses. And they realise that the oath that they've made is significant. An oath in the name of the Lord can't be broken. In fact, it is binding. And so, verse 18, the whole assembly grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders answered, we have given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now. This is what we'll do to them. We'll let them live so that God's wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them. They continued, let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers in the service of the whole assembly. So the leaders' promise to them was kept. Perhaps they're grumbling as they anticipate the kind of judgment that might befall on them. They'd seen what had happened to Achan and his family as he'd been unfaithful. And so it seems like the masses are thinking we need to take this into our own hands lest we face the judgment of God. But Joshua and the leaders again seem to be reinforcing their own same mistakes. And so what they do in response to this situation is develop their own plan. Again, they are silent in terms of inquiring of the Lord. It's all about this is what they are going to do. And so what the leaders recommend is that they would be obedient to this oath that has already been established. They want to show to the people that they need to honour this treaty because it was signed not in their name but in honour of their God. And so they themselves have to honour the oath so that they would be spared, that they would have refuge from the wrath of God. And so rather than going and conquering and touching the Gibeonites, they appoint them into a role within the Israelites as servants. Verse 22. Then Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and said, why did you deceive us by saying we live a long way from you, while actually you live near us? You are now under a curse. You will never be released from service as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God. Now the Gibeonites have been able to outsmart God's people, but you can never deceive God. You can't out-negotiate him. And so Joshua rebukes them for their actions, and he says that their actions have clear and lasting consequences. They, as a people, are cursed. The rhythm in the land was one of obedience resulting in blessing, but also this picture of disobedience leading to curse. And so they would never be able to work their way up from being the woodcutters to a more influential role. They would remain as this, as a reminder of the curse that is over them for trying to trick God, trying to deceive him, trying to outsmart him. Verse 24, they answered Joshua, your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God has commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all its inhabitants from before you. So we feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right to you. And now, this chapter is an interesting situation for us to understand because it seems so ambiguous about, are we cheering for the Gibeonites or are we condemning them? And here in their response to Joshua, I think there's something to cheer about. There's a sense that they remind Joshua about the promise that was meant to Moses, that God's people exclusively would live in God's land, that there had been a breach of that that's actually what drove a fear within the Gibeonite people that led to them trying to create this treaty, which led to them coming up with this crafty plan. And so we see that Joshua honours the oath that he's made, and that actually the Gibeonite strategy for them has worked. They've been spared death. Verse 26. So Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. That day he made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly to provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day. What we see from a result of the Gibeonites' plan is that they are provided refuge within the nation of Israel. The Israelites will not hurt them. In fact, the Israelites will protect them against others who come against them. The Israelites will honour the oath. And it's actually the oath that provides refuge. It provides refuge for the Israelites. They themselves are saved from the wrath of God as long as they honour their commitment made in the name of the Lord to the Gibeonites. And so there's a couple of reflections here about what this message means for us. This isn't the first time in the book of Joshua that someone who is outside the nation of Israel is brought in. The other contrasting figure is Rahab and her family. But there's some quite contrasting responses. Rahab's heart melted with fear as she too heard about the powerful work of the Lord, as she considered the reality of that on her existence and a need for her to submit. But she does that in a sense of being kind towards God's people. We so too hear that the Gibeonites feared what would happen to them because of what God was doing in his plans. But rather than responding in kindness, they respond in craftiness. And so there's a sense that the Gibeonites here aren't upheld as a great example as much as Rahab is. In fact, I think this chapter just sort of shows a similarity between the distortions of our heart, both in the Israelites and in the Gibeonites. You see, both of them leave God out of the equation. And both of them receive refuge from his judgment. For the Israelites and for Joshua, they have refuge from his judgment about their bad decisions, their decisions made in their own initiative without counsel to him, through being obedient to the oath that was made in his name. And the Gibeonites receive refuge from not only the Israelites conquesting them, but also other nations that might attack them through this same oath. And so for both the Israelites and the Gibeonites, the means of refuge is this one oath that was made to God. You see, this oath that was made, and having been made, was unable to be broken. You see, the confidence of having refuge was the fact that to break an oath would dishonour God. To breach the oath would mean that God can't be trusted. And so to uphold the oath is to uphold the name of God. Now this is a bit hard for us to really get a hold of, because contracts and oaths in our society, well, you know, they're not really as worth as much as the paper that they're written on. As long as you've got a big enough or an expertise legal team, then it seems like you can get yourself out of any contract that you've signed. But this oath, made in the name of the Lord, is something that is binding, something that is powerful. And so it is the means of refuge. Another key point in this chapter is the danger of God being silent. And the reason that God is silent in this chapter is because no one inquires of him. God is waiting for us to seek him, to ask of him, to petition him, to praise him. His word is relevant and applicable to our life, but his word is only active when it is accessed. And so he doesn't speak because he's not inquired of. Joshua and the people don't seek God, but rather they seek their own wisdom. They think they can handle this situation. But despite being silent in this whole chapter, it's actually the very character and nature of God that provides protection both for the Israelites and the Gibeonites. Such is the overwhelming awe of God's presence that just an oath that's made in his name is sufficient to provide real refuge for all in this scenario. The Israelites have refuge for the consequences of their actions. The Gibeonites have refuge from being overtaken. And so too we see how God powerfully works to deliver refuge for his people. And so this is a foretaste of the kind of refuge that is available to all in this world now. And so too now, the ability to find refuge in God is found solely in the awesome presence of God. God's plan continues to show that, like the Israelites and the Gibeonites, all of us are in need of refuge. Whether it's because we think we're tricky enough to outsmart God, or whether we think we're smart enough to just navigate life without him, we are all in need of him. We are all in need of his refuge. And in the Lord Jesus, we see an oath that was made that was powerful to provide refuge for all people, no matter where we've come from. That it's in the person and work of Jesus, who lived the perfect life in obedience, who died the death on our behalf, that there can be a binding refuge that all can find security in. In the book of Hebrews, that talks about how Jesus is better than anyone else that we can trust in, the writer says this: "So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Here we get this picture of the new life that Jesus has established, the new life that all who call on his name can have a sure hope in. A hope of being with God forever. A hope that God's presence resides in us now by his Spirit. A hope of refuge that is secured and assured, not because of our cunning schemes, and not because of our great plans, but because of God's promise, the promise of his presence. And so,